Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. If you like the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your podcast platform. It helps others to find us. Feel free also to send us questions and suggestions. Also, we're looking for sponsors to fund a marketing initiative to help us reach a wider audience. The future is rushing towards us, and the better informed we all are, the better it will be. Our guest today is Jeremy Kahn, a senior writer at Fortune magazine based in the UK. He writes about artificial intelligence and other disruptive technologies, from quantum computing to augmented reality. Previously, he was at Bloomberg for 8 years, again writing mostly about technology. And in moving to Fortune, he was returning to his journalistic roots as he started his career there in 1997 when he was based in New York. David and I have wanted to invite Jeremy onto the show for a while because we think his weekly newsletter, Eye on AI, is one of the very best non-technical sources of news and views about the technology. Jeremy, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Jeremy.
Thanks, David.
Let's start with a bit of biographical information. Where did you grow up and how did you get into journalism?
So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in the U.S., and I got into journalism in that I got interested as a high school student. I took a class in journalism in high school, and then my high school had a pretty good monthly student newspaper that I worked on. I liked that activity so much that when I went away to university, although I was not studying journalism, my first degree was in history, and then I have a master's degree in international relations. I went to a university that also had a very good student-run daily newspaper, and I went to work for that, first as a reporter and later as an editor, and I really enjoyed that experience. And then every summer at university, I did an internship with a professional publication, including the Financial Times in their Washington, D.C. bureau, which I did between my sophomore and junior year of university. So that's between the second and third year in the U.S. I loved that experience. I thought those guys were really inspiring who worked in that bureau for the FT, and they had all been forward correspondents in various places all around the world before ending up in Washington. And it was a very small bureau at the time. They're much larger now. But because it was so small, they gave me all these great opportunities. They sent me out, I think, on my second day to go cover something at the White House. And I thought that was pretty heady stuff and pretty cool, and really enjoyed that. And I covered stuff on Capitol Hill and at the Pentagon. And that summer actually was the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Haiti. I don't know if you remember this, back in 94, October 94, the U.S. invaded. But that whole summer, there was a sort of drumbeat of tension mounting, and I did quite a lot of coverage of that and around the speculation that there was going to be an invasion, which eventually there was. So that was quite a great experience, and that really sold me on the idea of becoming a journalist. And so then I went on to have 2 other internships, one at Newsweek, one back in Cleveland at sort of my hometown metropolitan paper, also working on kind of the business desk. And at Newsweek, I worked on the business desk. And then a guy I'd known who'd been my editor at Newsweek, he had gone subsequently on to Fortune. And when I was finishing graduate school and looking for my first job, I approached him to see if he knew anybody I should talk to. And he said, well, why don't you think about applying here at Fortune? We hire some entry-level reporters. And so I did that, and I started at Fortune in September 97 at that point. And that was covering all kinds of different stuff. I covered all kinds of different business topics. Accounting, I remember there was a lot of accounting scandals then. I covered a number of those. I covered manufacturing companies, and I also covered a bit of tech because that was the beginning of the dot-com boom, of course. So that was sort of my first experience covering tech.
And how did you get into tech as your main area? Because you started with global politics and went into business a bit.
Yeah.
Did you choose tech or did you sort of fall into it?
That's a good question. The answer is a little bit of both, but mostly fell into it. As I said, I'd done a tiny bit of tech coverage at the beginning of my career. Then I really left and I did a lot of political coverage, foreign policy coverage, did some environmental reporting. I even did a tiny bit of sports reporting at one point. And then had come back to the UK and to Bloomberg, which you mentioned at the top. I worked there for a number of years. First, I was working at Bloomberg mostly on finance and economics topics for a magazine that Bloomberg publishes called Bloomberg Markets Magazine. And one of those sort of economic stories I worked on was really about London's effort to establish itself as a global tech hub. And I thought that story was pretty interesting. And it was during the reporting of that story that I kept hearing about this company that had recently sold to Google called DeepMind. So I started looking into DeepMind a bit, and I thought they were really fascinating. And then sort of a few months later, there was a kind of rejiggering of things at Bloomberg, and there was an opportunity to move teams. And one of the teams that I had the opportunity to potentially move to was a technology reporting team. And I thought, oh, well, I've just done this tech coverage. I think this is a really fascinating area. I really found it refreshing sort of talking to people in tech compared to talking to people in finance. and decided to make the move over to covering technology. And then I did that for the next sort of 4 years at Bloomberg.
So your timing was impressive. You got into tech just as the fact of the 2012 Big Bang in AI and the arrival of deep learning, the fact of that was becoming apparent in the wider world, and it was starting to change everybody's lives. So congratulations on your timing.
Yeah, I didn't have much to do with it, but yeah, it worked out well.
David and I are among those who think that our technology is still improving at an exponential rate, which, as our listeners know very well, exponential curves are incredibly powerful. You get immense changes, and whatever happens in the past is trivial compared to what's happening in the future. Do you agree that we're improving at an exponential rate? And if so, does it make it hard to keep abreast of what's going on and explain it to everybody else?
Well, I'll take the second part of that question first. Whether it's exponential or not, it is moving at a very fast rate. I don't know if it's an exponential curve or just a linear curve with a very steep incline. But yes, it is very hard to keep on top of now. Much harder than it's ever been in the 7 years I've been covering AI as a topic. And it's very difficult to sort of see and read about everything that's happening and to try to stay abreast of it all. And it's only seemingly gotten harder in the last 6 months. Whether we're seeing sort of exponential improvements in technology is an interesting question. I think there's lots of things you can point to where you can sort of draw an exponential curve. And I think definitely in terms of sort of compute power and what that's enabling, a lot of things are exponential. There was a very interesting paper that I highlighted in the Eye on AI newsletter that I write that came out a couple months ago, and it was from some guys at Stanford looking at whether this idea of emergent properties in these large language models, which are powering a lot of the current hype around AI, whether they really exist or whether they're sort of mirages. And one of the things he did there was he said, well, look, if you use the sort of standard benchmarks, it looks like there's huge jumps in capability, which then allow you to draw these very nice exponential power curves about what's happening. And that's because a lot of these are sort of discrete tasks. Like the system either is able to answer this question correctly or not. You have these sort of binary tests. And he said, actually, but if you look below the surface, if you looked at what the machine is trying to answer, and with these large language models, what they're trying to do is predict the next token. And it's actually possible to go into these systems often and see what are the token predictions it's making. And now in a lot of these tests, what you're really measuring is, okay, it generates an output, which it thinks is the most likely next token. And then is that most likely next token the correct answer? And based on that, it looked like suddenly you were getting these huge jumps in ability as these systems got bigger. But what he had done, he said, okay, well, instead of doing that, let's just look at what the token predictions are. And it turns out that the token predictions were moving in a much more linear way. So a system would still be getting the wrong answer. But if you looked at the second most likely answer, that was actually the right answer, maybe in a system that was just a little bit smaller than the next largest system. So he said, actually, a lot of these things are much more linear than you think, and probably more predictable if you look at them on this continuous token prediction scale, as opposed to simply looking at binary benchmarks. And I thought that was very interesting. I think that's probably true of some of these things, which is not to say they're not moving very, very fast. And again, I think in some areas in compute, if you look at what you're able to do today with an H100 NVIDIA GPU compared to what you maybe did just 5 years ago, there's been an exponential change. So I do think there are aspects of this that are exponential, but I think some of the things that people point to as being exponential may actually be linear, but with a fairly steep curve.
Or even linear with leaps every now and then, because it seems to me that the underlying technology is developing at an exponential rate. The power of compute, the power of $1,000 worth of compute, certainly has been going exponentially for many years, and there's a lot of debate about whether Moore's law's dead or it should be renamed because it's now no longer about how many transistors you can put on a chip. It's also about the architecture of the chips and whether you can make them 3D and so on.
Yeah.
The underlying tech does seem to be moving at an exponential rate and probably will continue. But the effects that we all see, they come in leaps, they come in steps. So the step from nothing to early GPTs was a big step. The step from GPT 3.5, Chat GPT, to GPT 4 was a big step. No doubt the same will happen with virtual reality and with self-driving cars. It's partly because we have to embrace and adopt and adapt to technologies for them to become widespread and really useful and omnipresent. It's probably also because the technology itself, it doesn't equate, it doesn't correlate entirely with the underlying compute power. But overall, taking a step back and a wider perspective, it ends up accelerating and being very, very fast, which, as I say, must make it pretty tricky in your line of work.
I think you do see these big leaps forward. And sometimes the leap forward is not on the underlying AI technology, but something having to do with the interface to that technology. So I think what made ChatGPT such a seminal moment was this interface and some of the things that they had done around what they call reinforcement learning from human feedback. This is like giving a system human feedback in order to try to improve its answers over what the base model would naturally try to respond with. And the combination of those two things with ChatGPT produced this sort of leap forward, which I think took everyone by surprise, including a lot of the people at OpenAI, because they felt like, well, the underlying model is actually not our most powerful model. And the underlying model had been out there and available in a different form to people for quite a while, but it was available through this thing they called the OpenAI Playground, and you had to have some more technical skills to use it. And there was some quite fiddly, jargony things about they had sort of sliding scales that you had to use to adjust various output parameters to get it to do what you wanted. It was not so intuitive to use. And then they came out with this chatbot interface that allowed you to interact with the model in very plain dialogue without any of these complicated bells and whistles and dials and knobs to turn. And people loved it, and it created this huge leap forward, the fastest growing consumer technology ever. And that was mostly around the interface and not around the underlying model. But you're right, it created this giant leap forward that's launched us into the current generative AI hype cycle and revolution. And I think there are these leaps forward. I mean, GPT-4 is a fairly significant leap forward in sort of how much better it was than some of the other models. And then there are these giant leaps forward sometimes in architecture. So when transformers were invented in 2017, that was a big leap forward over previous systems that had been trying to do many of the same things. Actually, the transformer was interesting because it was originally designed for visual tasks, and it was shown to just be a lot simpler and better architecture than using these convolutional neural networks, which is what had been used before for most of the vision tasks. And then very quickly people realized that the same architecture was really good for language, because in language what you're trying to do is predict the next thing or a missing thing in a sequence. And it made sense to kind of deploy these for language, and that's what resulted in this giant leap forward in natural language processing. And again, that was a big step change.
Yeah. And quite different in many ways to previous breakthroughs in technology, because you don't have to change much about the way you work to start using GPT-4. In fact, you can just fold it straight into your workflow. I mean, many people can. I've said before on this podcast that I write travel books as well as AI books, and I wrote a book on Rome recently with significant help from GPT-4. I had it write the first draft of some of the chapters. It confabulated a bit, made some stuff up. For some reason, it really likes Federico Fellini. It loved to put stories about Federico Fellini in various chapters. So I had a lot of work to do, but I think it saved about half the time it took me to write the book, which is a huge increase in productivity. And it still surprises me that we're not seeing big increases in productivity across the economy. I know that concerns about privacy, data leakage, and obviously the hallucinations are slowing it down a bit. I'm surprised there isn't more evidence of its effectiveness. Where do you think this will take us next? What do you think will be the sort of short-term impact of GPT-4?
That's a great question. I think short-term we are going to see or start to see big leaps in productivity due to GPT-4 and similar large language models. I think it won't just be GPT-4 because that capability is quickly being copied by others, competitors. But collectively, that group of large language models, I think we are going to see within about 2 years big leaps in productivity in a lot of fields. I think we're going to see the beginning of people using, in almost every profession, some sort of AI co-pilot that will help them to perform their role. And it won't replace them, but it will just make them more efficient. It'll take away some of the tasks they used to have to do. And where we may see an effect on employment, I don't think we're going to see, at least in the 2-year sort of time horizon, mass unemployment. But I do think you're going to see companies maybe slow down hiring. And there'll be cases where people would have thought before that they had to hire somebody, where now they feel like they don't necessarily have to hire someone. So there may be these gradual economic impacts in that sense. And there may be some impacts around wage depression, which I think may start to see even within 2 years in some fields, where the fact that you can take a person who's not very skilled and give them something like GPT-4 and have them use it, still you might need a more skilled person to supervise them. That was probably true anyway if you were hiring a less skilled person. You can do that, and you might be able to hire someone really without the kind of experience you used to have for that role. And what that may have the effect of doing is increasing actually the labor supply for that particular role, and then you won't have to pay people as much. So I think that'll be an interesting effect that we might see. It's similar to what the effect that people sort of saw with Uber, where Uber allowed everyone to be a taxi driver, and then all you need to do is know how to drive and have access to a vehicle. And as a result, the licensed cab drivers couldn't charge as much, or they saw their fares drop. To some extent, they'd lock themselves in, I think, through various guild systems where they had to charge a certain amount, but then they weren't getting as much business because they were being underpriced by someone. I think we may start to see that phenomenon in other professions as well, thanks to this technology.
In many cases, that should be a good thing. The idea that you have to pay $1 million in New York to become a taxi driver, which you did in the old days, that shows you there's something wrong with that market. And so something that comes along and breaks that open is probably a good thing.
Yeah, it's great, as long as you're not a yellow cab driver.
As long as you're not one of the people who paid $1 million.
Yeah, exactly.
For your medallion.
Yeah, for your medallion. Yeah. So I think that's the issue. I think it depends who you are. I think overall, it should be very good for the economy. I think if you look at overall growth numbers, I think it's a very good argument to be made that in a 5-year time horizon, we're heading towards a big increase in productivity across the economy, and that should be really good for growth.
Yeah. One of the interesting questions is, will companies just use it to cut costs, save money, by employing one fewer people in a team, or will they use it to improve the quality of their output? So if you've got 10 analysts in an office room working away, you could just sack half of them, or you could double or treble the value of their output collectively by using these tools. And it strikes me that the most successful companies will be the ones who do the latter, who actually improve their output, improve their value. People who just use it to save costs will find themselves being outcompeted, I would think, but we will see.
Yeah, I think the verdict's out on that. And I think there's a progression in these technologies generally where the first thing people do is look to save costs. Because actually to do what you're talking about, where you really see increased value, often requires quite a lot of reimagining the organization as a whole, rethinking what you're doing, sort of really thinking very strategically. And I think firms, particularly when technology is changing so quickly, they kind of struggle to do that. They're kind of looking to, how can I integrate it into my current strategy, my current way of thinking? And it's almost too much to get their head around. Actually, to get the most out of this, you're going to have to rethink what strategy you're pursuing, what it is you're doing, and all of your processes. If they're already engaged in that process anyway, as part of some sort of digital transformation process, then there could be a very good opportunity to integrate technologies such as GPT-4 and these large language models from others like Anthropic, or even some of the open source ones from people like Hugging Face, into your process somehow, into that digital transformation. And that may be the way firms see the real benefit here. People always make the analogy to electrification, where factories initially just used the same factory setup, but they just electrified the motors. And then it turned out that actually it was much better if you had to redesign your entire plant, because all of these tools just needed little distributed motors and power centers. You didn't need a central power plant, which you needed when the factories were run by steam. But what people did at first is just replace the giant steam boiler in the middle of the plant with a big electric dynamo. And it turned out that wasn't really the most efficient way to run a factory on electricity.
What's fascinating is that transition took about 2 or 3 decades from the first companies who were thinking about it. My question for you is, you've talked about incremental adjustments. You talked about companies reorganizing around the technologies that are already available, like GPT-4 and its competitors. But do you imagine that in the next 2 years there will be other step-ups in technological capability, not just incremental improvements on what we already have, but there might be new possibilities from GPT-5 or new players coming in, perhaps Anthropic, perhaps others that we haven't heard of, who suddenly will put even more possibilities onto the table?
Yes, I think that's possible. And I also think, besides using sort of the existing capabilities, the thing that's clearly coming next that people are really working on is some sort of universal digital assistance, still based on a transformer model, but instead of predicting the next most likely word, what they're essentially predicting is the next most likely action. And you might combine these with large language models such that the large language model, you give it a goal, it develops kind of sub-goals to achieve that goal, and then it's going to predict the next most likely action to take to achieve those goals. And if we get these things right, and if we can deal with some of the safety concerns around them, and I'm not talking about sort of the existential risk safety concerns, I'm just talking about how do you guarantee that the thing actually performs the task that you want it to do in the way you want it to do. I always use the example of you want to go do something and it decides that part of that process involves buying you very expensive plane tickets to Rio or something. How do you make sure it doesn't do that if that's not what you wanted it to do? And I think there's a risk with the current technologies where we don't really have a good idea of how to solve problems like hallucination, and we don't really have a good idea of how to solve common sense unspecified sub-goals. I think if you gave a human assistant who had any sense these goals and they thought, oh, maybe we should be buying very expensive plane tickets, they would come back and check with you to make sure, is it okay if I go and spend $50,000 on plane tickets for this? And you'd have a chance to say, no, don't do that. It's not clear the way we're designing these systems that they're going to necessarily always come back and ask us. And I think that's something we're going to want them to do. But I think in the near term, that is going to be one of these technologies we see a bunch of people working on. And I think Bill Gates has said that whoever gets to this one first, that could be the future of all interaction with computing. Because you aren't going to have too many of these universal assistants. You really only need maybe one for your personal life, and maybe each company will sort of have one that you'll interact with as an employee or as a customer. And it will essentially do all these tasks for you. And it will be the thing that actually interacts with other pieces of software and goes out and acts as kind of an agent for you on the web. And I think we're not that far away from systems like that. And there are a number of these firms working on it. I think Google's hinted very strongly that they're working on this. I think we can assume that Microsoft is working on it, although they haven't said as much about it. We know that there's a company called Adept, which is a well-funded startup that is essentially working on this. There's another well-funded startup called Inflection that has sort of said that's what they're going to work on in the long term, although as a first product, they've come out with a, in some ways, dull chatbot that just acts as sort of empathetic listener, but that can't do very much else. But it's interesting. So there's clearly a race on for that. And I think whoever gets there, there'll be tremendous potential there and tremendous transformation. And that's really even without getting to kind of human level intelligence, which I personally still think we're a little ways from, and we don't quite know how to get to. I'm in the camp of thinking that these transformer-based technologies will not in and of themselves get us there. And I don't think you can just build GPT-5 with the same architecture and assume that we're going to get human level intelligence, including common sense reasoning, including a lot of the kind of logical skills that we really want these systems to have, long-term planning, the real ability to do strategy for us. I don't think we're going to get there with a transformer-based model. There are a lot of people thinking that too, and thinking about, well, how do we get there? What do we need to do to get to a more human-like AI? I'm not sure we really know, but it's not to say that somebody, in the same way the Transformer kind of came out of nowhere and then within 5 years has like dominated everything, it's not to say that somebody won't have a breakthrough in the next 2 years.
Twice in the last decade, we've had big breakthroughs which weren't expected by most of the research community. The Big Bang in 2012, which introduced deep learning, the Big Bang in 2017, as you say, which introduced transformers. Most people were not expecting those to happen. Well, what's to say that in another 5 years we won't have another Big Bang, which will take us a lot further yet? And in fact, we're already on this pathway, as you say, toward very powerful agents which can do an awful lot of what people do. And if we train these agents with a level of common sense, and I take common sense simply to mean a reasonably good working model of how things in the real world work. You know, the fact that if I throw a chair from here to there, it will break a window, that will get me into all sorts of trouble, and I can reasonably forecast a lot of the consequences which would follow. AIs at the moment don't have that ability, but we could give it to them, we could train it, even if we have to show them loads and loads of videos of what happens in the real world, they can learn. So these advanced agents, to what extent are they going to be AI complete, which just means artificial general intelligence, and the threshold point beyond which is superintelligence? It might be that we're on that path already, and it might be that it's not very far away. There's a lot of smart people who think it is a lot further, but then there's a lot of people like Jeff Hinton saying, wow, you know, it could happen in the next 10 years or so. We just really don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we don't know. I think the honest answer is we really don't know. And it's quite possible we could get there, and it's also possible we won't, but I think we don't really know the answer. And as you say, there are very smart people on both sides of this debate. I think it's clear we're going to get systems that are much more capable and can act as agents for us. The question is, how smart will those agents be, and how controllable would they really be? I think my concern is sort of just kind of taking the current architectures and trying to do it doesn't get you all the way there, and you may end up with agents that are not particularly controllable. They can do quite a lot. They're quite capable, but not particularly controllable. And they don't really have this common sense element. It's not clear exactly how you get them to have that, but I think it's interesting.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
Aren't some of the theories of physics that GPT-4 seems to have worked out by itself or learned somehow, isn't that a step towards common sense? If you give various puzzles to GPT 3.5, it often gets them wrong because it needs to have real-world knowledge to fill in what's not spelt out. Whereas if you give the same puzzles to GPT-4, often it's very thoughtful and astute in its replies. So isn't that a step forward? Maybe we'll get to this common sense knowledge without people explicitly programming it or explicitly thinking about it. It'll just turn out that we do various things. And surprisingly, this means they've now got much more common sense than we had in mind.
Perhaps. We don't really understand so much about these systems, and I don't think we know why GPT-4 is necessarily better than GPT-3.5 at some of these questions, which it is, as you say. I don't think it's learned in the same way you and I think about learning. It may have been exposed to more data and for longer training runs, which is interesting. But the question is, what distribution of data has it learned? What these systems are not very good at is extrapolating to conceptual level stuff as a human would understand it. There still seems to be some brittleness around what they hold as concepts. So it may be that if you ask it a question that's fairly in the middle of the distribution of what it's learned, it answers pretty competently. But if you come up with a rather convoluted example involving common sense reasoning that would be at the tail of what the data distribution is, where it won't have seen very many examples of that in the training set, it may still fall down, which means it doesn't understand the universal principle. And the problem is, as you say, you can ask it a question and it answers very competently, so you may be fooled into thinking it has a kind of universal understanding of this concept when it doesn't. And I think that's actually the real danger with these systems that we have right now is that. It's that in some ways they seem so capable, and yet we know that they're very fallible. And the question is, it's very hard to tease out exactly when they're going to fail and exactly what they're going to be very capable at. That makes them less useful than we'd like them to be for a lot of human use cases. Because you're sort of in the situation, well, just try it and see if it works. And then you can try something else that's very similar and it will fail. And you just don't know why it failed and succeeded in one case. And I think we have to figure all this out. I mean, there's a lot to tease out with why these systems work that we haven't mastered. That doesn't mean that these aren't going to be really impactful technologies and in the very near term, very impactful. But I think it's why businesses have been a bit cautious about adopting some of this too. I think they realize this. And if you're going to build your whole business on something, you want the technology to be reliable. And right now, I'd say these systems are sort of powerful, but not quite reliable, not reliable enough. And I think that is one of the things holding it back at the moment. When you ask sort of like why we haven't seen giant transformation already, I think that's the answer.
For sure. If you're running a big company, if you're running a big financial services company or a manufacturing company, you don't want your people to be using these systems willy-nilly without double, treble, quadruple checking the output. However, you do want them, I would think, to experiment with ways of improving their workflow. And if I was running such a company, I would say to people, we're going to trust you. You've got access to these systems. We can't stop you having access to them. Do use them to see how you can improve your workflow. Check them very carefully, check the outputs very carefully. And if you find something that works really well, share it with your colleagues because that will enhance our productivity. So I'd have a bottom-up, massive experimentation process going on. I know that will scare a lot of people. A lot of people say that's entirely illegitimate and shouldn't be done, but I think it's going to happen and should happen. That's only half the story, because the other half of the story is these systems will probably provide companies with a way of changing their business models, doing things totally differently. You know, it may be possible for some professional services companies, for instance, to set up small departments, becoming large departments, which have no people in them. The long-rumoured, decentralised, autonomous organisations, DAOs. And you need people to be working on those in kind of skunk works and separate away from the company and then designing something which would be transformational and then introducing it to the main body. So I'd have that twin track process going on, bottom-up experimentation and people experimenting with changes that will make a really big strategic difference.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of smart companies are actually doing that. I think for some of them, the issue's been in terms of just telling everyone, go ahead and play around with this stuff and see how you can use it. One of the concerns, of course, has been if you're using the consumer-facing versions of these, is there this risk of data leakage? So some companies have banned it. I think Lockheed Martin and Samsung and Apple and JP Morgan, I think, have said don't use the consumer product for your work because we're too concerned about information sort of leaking out. First of all, the employees of those tech companies that have created these systems potentially have access to some of that data. That's a potential security issue. But then more importantly is the next version of the software is very likely going to be trained on your prompts and responses, which then means that in a future version of the software, it might be possible to get that future version to leak proprietary data out again with the right prompts. So firms have been a little bit wary in that regard. And what they've all been trying to do is set up some kind of API call in a sandboxed environment in the cloud that will enable their employees to play around with this stuff without that risk of data leakage. And it's taken them some months to do that and get all that worked out. But I think we're going to start seeing many more firms that have set up these kind of sandboxes where they are walled off and they can have a pretty good assurance that their data is not going to leak. And then they are going to tell all their employees, start playing with this, because I think you're absolutely right. You need that bottom-up approach. But yes, you also probably need some people going off in small groups and thinking about how could you redesign an entire business around this.
Jeremy, could we tap into another part of your expertise briefly? We were talking about the risks of security, but maybe there are risks of geosecurity. Your background includes international relations. These systems won't just have impact on jobs and on national economies, they could have big impacts on international relations. Already we're seeing various political leaders, including here in the UK, Rishi Sunak, saying they're going to take a central role in defining the future of AI. What's your view on how AI is going to be played out in the world of international relations?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting. There's several dimensions to this. Clearly, if you get to something that is very powerful, AGI or superintelligence, that is a technology with huge national security implications and a nationally important asset and could really shake up world order potentially or make one country much more powerful than another. So I think there is that aspect that all these countries are very interested in this race towards AGI and where are we on that path. And if we get there, how is that going to be governed and controlled? And there's also talk about international regulation of the potential downside risks of superintelligence and whether we need a sort of agency set up along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor what's going on with the attempt to train very large systems that might just have emergent properties that bring us very close to AGI or to superintelligence. And that could, if some people would be believed, pose a grave risk to all of humankind. So there's that aspect of it. There's the soft power aspect of it too, about, yes, what are the regulatory rules going to be? Who's going to be important in helping to set those? And that's where I think Rishi Sunak's jumped in and seen a great opportunity for the UK to kind of assert itself and become at least a broker, a location. He's offered London up as a place for international negotiations over what this licensing regime might be or how we might set up this international atomic energy-like body. I think for him, that's just good politics. It sort of shows the UK still has some soft power. It shows it's still playing a role in setting the global rules. And that's very important, particularly post-Brexit, that it do that. So there's good geopolitical reasons for Rishi Sunak to do that. And then there's this military application short of AGI of all this stuff, which is very interesting as well. The Pentagon is researching all this stuff and is trying to build large language models of its own. And some of these would act as battlefield advisors. You could potentially integrate lots of sensor information and then interact with that in natural language. It could be providing commanders assessments and suggestions of what action they should take next. And then you might be able to ask it to send orders out to all of your units in the field just in natural language and have all of that done through some sort of automated system, which may reduce the time it takes to make decisions, which of course in battles tend to be critical. They always say if you can operate within the decision cycle of your opponent, you tend to win. So this attempt to accelerate decision-making in many ways is seen as a kind of strategic asset. And the Chinese government is, of course, very interested in this in multiple aspects, very interested in what this can do to supercharge their military abilities, but also very interested in these technologies as a form of social control and political control internally as well, I think. And that, of course, is the concern. That's one of the reasons that there was this famous call for this pause on development of more powerful AI technologies. And one of the main arguments against that was, okay, well, if everybody in the West agrees to pause and the Chinese don't agree to pause, and it's very unlikely they would, do they jump out ahead? Because if they have 6 months or a year of further research, unrestricted in any way, and we have arbitrarily restricted ourselves for that period of time, does that give them a huge advantage? In certain contexts in the US, that's a fairly salient argument, particularly with people up on Capitol Hill, and perhaps with the White House as well. That's one of the reasons that was sort of a dead-on-arrival proposal.
It turns out that China isn't the problem. China already has told its tech giants to slow down, and China undoubtedly would agree to steps to monitor and regulate the power of these large models. The real threat is people like Putin and Kim Jong-un who obey no rules whatsoever and would just blithely ignore any moratorium. They don't have the power to build large language models yet, but as the price of technology comes down, within a foreseeable number of years, they will. And with Sunak, I think it's incredibly ironic that one of the great false promises of Brexit was that it was going to relieve Britain of the overweening red tape and regulation of Europe. And what's the first thing that they do to interpose us in the debate about AI is set up a new regulatory unit. Ridiculously ironic. Jeremy, you've been very generous with your time. We've had a fascinating conversation. I'd just like to ask you, Is there a thought, a sort of governing thought, a message that you would like to get people to think about AI and its future, something that people perhaps don't realize yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be one of the most transformative technologies, certainly of the last 50 years, if not the last 100 or more years. People really need to start get their head around that and start playing around with it a bit more and embracing it. The other thing is that there's just tremendous potential for positive change here in areas like medicine and drug discovery, as well as in productivity. And yet there are these downside risks, and I think we need to be cognizant very much of both and try to hold sort of both in our heads at the same time and not get overly frightened by the doomsday scenarios, because I think those are fairly unlikely in the near term, but at the same time be mindful of risks that are sort of here today. And I think those are some of the ones I've tried to highlight. I think we may end up giving sort of agency to systems that are not fully reliable yet. I think that's a risk that people will need to focus a bit more on. And I think there's a risk that I've highlighted a couple times in the newsletter about misinformation. That's sort of here today. These systems are very good at making things up, as we know. And if your whole goal is to make up false information, they're pretty good at that. They can write all kinds of untrue things for you very quickly. So I think that's the other big concern that we need to kind of come to grips with. But we shouldn't let that stop us from using the technologies. I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle, as it were, and I don't think we should try, because there's so many really positive things that can come about through the use of these systems as co-pilot technologies and enhancement for productivity. And as I say, in ways of generating new ideas for medicines and potentially new ideas for healthcare.
Yeah, lots of fantastic opportunities on the upside and some serious risks to weigh as we take advantage of those opportunities. Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for joining the London Futurists podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much, Calum, and thank you so much, David.
Thank you.